Hello, my name is Michael Freeston, Director of Quality Improvement at the Early Years Alliance, and I'm delighted to welcome to this podcast today Tamsin, Early Years Consultant.
Hello.
And my colleague Melanie, Pilcher, Quality and Standards Manager at the Early Years Alliance.
Hello.
The idea for this podcast came around from work that both Tamsin and Melanie do, supporting practitioners, both in settings and childminders, in preparation for their inspection. And the conversation went along the lines of, how can I best use Birth to Five Matters, both the publication and the online resources, to help with that preparation? So we thought it'd be a good idea to pull together some of the questions that generally come about, to allow people to share them, reflect with them, and give consideration to how best the resources that have been produced by the group can be used. So, if you don't mind, I'll start with Tamsin thinking through a central point of the EIF for Ofsted now is the concept of curriculum, both the three I's, but also that view within the definition of curriculum that how children learn is as important as what they learn. Can you just expand on that, please, Tamsin?
Yes, so curriculum tends to refer to what we want children to learn during their time with us. So you could look upon that as including your intent, but also the implementation, which is how we put everything into practice, and also the impact, which is how we know that our curriculum is helping our children to make progress.
So in fact, Tamsin, really when we're talking about curriculum, we're just talking about generally everything we want children to know and understand, everything we want them to learn.
Yes, so everything we do, everything we plan, everything we teach our children.
And it's interesting, isn't it, Tamsin, as well, that we've got, in the EYFS, they talk about the educational programmes, but Ofsted tend to refer to curriculum. So the educational programmes tend to be that high-level description of what we can do with children, don't they?
Yes, so the educational programmes are more like the areas of learning and development, whereas actually our curriculum is broader than that, and it covers other things that we're doing as well. The way we're setting things up, for example, in the setting, our routine, the way that we're including the children through the opportunities that we provide them during the day.
So just picking up on the conversation so far, you've referenced planning, but also how the various elements of the curriculum can be spontaneous and are in the moment. How do you balance planning with responsiveness?
So lots of settings will, for example, now plan in the moment with their children. And that's a great way of working where we're looking for those teachable moments and we're working with those children, following their interests during the day.
Can you just expand on that phrase of teachable moment for a second, please?
So this would be when we see the child doing something, or they might bring us something, show us something, or we might just simply observe them playing in a certain area and we think, oh, this is an opportunity to encourage that child to find out more or to engage with the child. Maybe we'd ask a key question. Maybe we would sort of think, oh, I've got a resource that will support this play.
So really what we're saying as well is that it's about those teaching skills that Ofsted define, isn't it? About how we model language,
yes.
how we show and demonstrate, how we listen to the children, how we look for that opportunity to scaffold the learning that's happening.
Yes, absolutely.
So we often get the question, well, how does that all play out when we do termly planning in our provision? How does that balance through, please?
So Every setting will plan in different ways, and the great thing about the revised EYFS is that we're all free to choose how we do this. Ofsted are not expecting to see a particular sort of planning. They won't be asking to look at our documentation in that way at all. So what we're actually trying to do is think about our children and what we need to do in order to best support them. And for some people, that will be perhaps writing things down in some sort of termly plan, like you mentioned. For other people, they might be following the children's interests on a daily basis and not writing it down, and that's okay.
Absolutely, and I think that's the really important thing to get across, isn't it? That actually, if we want child-led learning, we may have an idea of something that we're going to introduce to the child, and that's like what stimulates them, isn't it, really? How we actually try to engage them, and then we follow their interests.
Absolutely, and this is where intent comes into play.
Yes.
So Ofsted talk about intent, and this is about what we want our children to learn during their time with us. And that might be during the day, while we're interacting with them. It might be longer term than that.
Definitely. And I think from my experience, people are quite clear about what we mean by intent and implementation, actually. And I think they've really got that, the idea of it's about what we want children to know and learn. And the implementation, I think we've just started to touch on that, haven't we, really, about how we actually make that happen, what we do, what we say, what we provide for them.
Absolutely. So the implementation is literally what we're doing
Yes,
to teach our children. And so that will include our continuous provision, our enhanced provision. It will be about our daily routine and how we're putting our policies into practice.
Definitely, and the environment as well, very much so, how we organise the environment, really, because that is, as I think it's Montessori always said, it's the third teacher in the room, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think Reggie look at it that way
Yes,
as well.
Definitely.
It's very much about the learning environment. So what are we providing and why? Thinking about the resources that we offer, the way we organise the environment, and of course we're thinking about inside and outside.
Definitely, especially, post-pandemic, as we sort of move towards that, people have used the outdoors really effectively, haven't they? And people are really acknowledging now the learning potential for actually being outdoors. So that's really exciting.
Yes.
Just to pick up on the third I, where you've been talking about implementation, and I know this is something Melanie and I discussed from settings a number of times, is the level of confidence of practitioners to be able to demonstrate the progress, the impact of the third I of curriculum. And that's often a tension where you've indicated that there is not necessarily a focus on documentation in inspection now. How do you demonstrate consistently to Ofsted inspectors that the curriculum you're delivering does have impact and the children are making progress? Tamsin first.
So we do need to think whether our children are making progress or not. And so some ways we can do that is thinking about those 7 areas of learning and development and actually consider if children are, what children are doing, building on that, and then thinking, what were they doing? What are they doing now? So we're literally looking at the progress that they've made. Ways that we can do that would include looking at levels of engagement. So are children engaged in their play? Can we look at involvement and well-being, for example? Thinking about the way that the children are interacting with the different resources that we have or the provocations that we might create for our children to engage with. So also thinking about what our children know and what they can do and asking ourselves, how do we know this? How do we know that they can do this? So knowing our children really well is really important.
So it sounds from Tamsin's discussion about impact that it actually is quite a complicated concept, Melanie. Could you give any further advice for practitioners?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, we know if we wanted to sum it up in just a few words, we'd say that impact is about the difference that we've made, about how children are progressing in their learning. But actually, Ofsted give us the answers as well. Not only do they set the test, Michael, when they come out to inspect, but actually, if we look at the inspection handbook, it tells us exactly what they're looking for in terms of impact.
And where do you keep that information about what they know, Melanie?
In your head, first and foremost. And this is the point that Ofsted are trying to get across to us as well, isn't it? That this isn't about generating paperwork. This is about what the practitioner, what the key person knows and understands about that child. When Ofsted are inspecting, they don't want to read reams of paperwork. They don't want to see huge learning journals that have been compiled. And there's nothing wrong with those at all, but I think we have to think very carefully about how we do them and why we do them. So the knowledge that the practitioner holds in their head is really important. And the other thing, Tamsin, as well, I think it's so important that people establish those starting points in the first place.
Yes.
And again, this is something that Ofsted want to know. Well, where did this child start? Where is this child going? Where is this child now? and where do you want this child to go next? What is it we want them to know and understand next? So by all means, yes, we do make notes still, we do still record our observations occasionally, but it's when the child has done something new, when they've achieved something new, when they've mastered that skill that they've been working on. And during inspection, Ofsted want to observe practice, they want to talk to the key person, they want to see what that child is demonstrating in their learning.
Absolutely. So they'll be looking at impact through the children in your setting during the inspection.
Definitely.
So we're talking about being confident across the entire staff team about being able to articulate where a child started and taken it forward. So I would imagine that's a concern on the part of managers, that actually it's got to be a coherent articulation of the story throughout the entire team. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that this is where the Birth to Five Matters materials really come into their own, because there's a wealth of material, particularly on the internet. There's on the website additional resources that we can look at. We can use that to support our staff in training. We can have discussions in our staff meetings about what we want children to learn, how we're going to build on that knowledge of the children, and talk about our individual children with each other, but in an informed way. So we're using a knowledge of child development.
And I think that's what Birth to Five really gives us, isn't it? Because the more confident we are in understanding how children learn and develop, then the less likely we have to rely on things like producing paperwork as evidence. Because actually, when we are confident ourselves that this child is progressing as I would expect them to, then, we can talk to the Ofsted inspector about that, and they will know that the practitioner really knows that child, which is exactly what they're looking for.
Absolutely. During training, I often ask people, think about one of your key children, or if you're a childminder, think about one of the children you look after. Could you talk to me about them for a minute? And they usually can. It's quite simple for them because they know that child inside out. So I think it's just thinking about their knowledge of the child and having that discussion on the day with the inspector.
Thank you. Just picking up on that useful example there about a practice session, as it were. One of the particular issues that often gets raised is, what about the children with special educational needs or disabilities, and any particular consideration that's necessary in terms of identifying areas of progress, teaching moments in that situation?
So again, with special educational needs and disabilities, we do need to demonstrate that our children are making progress. We want to be looking at whether they are achieving their potential, really. There are some there's a great section of the Birth to Five Matters materials, which is the inclusion and equality section, which talks about adopting a strengths-based approach and really starting with that child and what they can do and building on that. Because we need to think, are they achieving the best possible outcome for themselves? And that's what Ofsted will be looking for as well.
Absolutely, and that's where I think you need to focus your efforts as well. If you've got a child that's got emerging additional needs, or a child that you're concerned about, then you are going to want to perhaps do more observations, make more recordings of what's gone on, assessment and so on, so that you can actually seek that additional support. And if you're doing that, rather than focusing on those children where you're observing them kick a ball 5 times over a 2-week period, it's much more effective. Put your energies and your focus where it needs to be with the children.
Yes, so we'll be observing them, noticing their steps or their achievements that they're making. We can share those sort of wow moments, if you like, with parents and carers as well. Sometimes for a child with additional needs, we might have some other paperwork like a My Support Plan or a care plan or an IEP that we need to perhaps complete. But hopefully, because we're doing less paperwork elsewhere, we'll have more time to spend with our children to focus on them.
And it is really about tuning into every child, isn't it? Because we're not ignoring our children that we don't have concerns for, but because practitioners are so tuned into every child all the time, we know, don't we, when we need to intensify our focus on a child.
Absolutely. And again, that's where our having a secure knowledge of child development comes into play, because then you'll be able to recognise if a child isn't quite developing in the way that we might hope they would.
And again, it's Birth to 5 Matters, isn't it, that really supports us in that. It's almost like our handbook, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Melanie, picking up on Tamsin's comments about progress, can you expand a little on the balance between progress and tracking?
Yes, for me, tracking, it's something that evolved really out of those predetermined statements that we had in the original non-statutory guidance to the EYFS. And what people fell into the trap of doing was actually thinking that they were moving children from one statement to the next and tracking their progress that way. Well, of course, that's not child-led.
No.
And so, although in the original non-statutory guidance, it was always said that those statements were meant to be examples only of what children might be doing, people tended to use them almost like a safety net to say, well, yes, we've covered all of those things. Whereas when we know a child, we know how they're progressing, we know what their starting points were, and we know how they've moved on. And that's down to the individual child rather than those predetermined statements.
Absolutely, because we know that learning isn't linear and it doesn't follow that set pattern for every child. So what we have in the Birth to 5 Matters materials are those ranges that we can look at, covering those different 8 age bands, and think about best fit and where our child would actually fit. So when we're using those charts towards the end of the Birth to 5 Matters materials, that's how we can do it. So we start with the child and we think, which range is the best one that describes where this child is. And of course, no document could include every aspect of child development. It would just be enormous. So what we're actually doing is trying to get ideas from the document. And sometimes we'll be able to, find a statement that will help us to know what the next step might be for the child. And other times that won't be in the document at all. It will just be out of our heads or through talking to another colleague. And that's okay as well.
Because what that actually makes us do, Tamsin, is focus on the unique child.
Yes.
That every child is different. Every child learns at different rate and in different ways. And we can never do that if we hark back to that old method of looking at those predetermined statements.
Absolutely. So in terms of where this leaves us with tracking and tracking children's progress, we do need to be able to identify children's starting points and make sure that our children are making progress through their learning. How we do that might not be or will not be through highlighting or tick sheets and that sort of thing. What it will be through is a number of different ways. So it might be through our planning, it might be through our observations, many of which will be in our heads, and it will also be through our assessment processes. And it's about the confidence that every key person has, thinking about their child, knowing their child really well. And as we said earlier, just being able to talk confidently about what they can do and their progress.
So, Tamsin, if you were looking to give 2 pieces of advice for a setting manager who's considering the preparation for the next inspection, what do you think they would be?
First of all, reflect upon what is it like to be a child in this setting. So think about all aspects of your provision through the child's eyes. So that would be my first piece of advice. And my second piece of advice would be to think through those 3 eyes, talk about them with your staff so that it becomes familiar language and familiar ways of working. Because then if we are asked about these things, we won't be left floundering and wondering what to say, because actually we've already talked about this and we can confidently say what our intent is through our different aspects of our provision, how we implement things, and also the positive impact we're having on our children.
Before I come to Melanie with the same question, I think that's an interesting point, that let's not get daunted by the language. Intention, implementation and impact, we know what they mean. just make sure people feel confident in being able to use it and speak Ofsted from that point of view. Melanie, same question to you. 2 areas of particular key preparation.
Well, firstly, I think it's about coverage as well, isn't it, Tamsin, of those 7 areas of learning and development, because what we do find, if people aren't really observing and thinking about how children are progressing and how they're using the environment, the learning environment that's there, sometimes some of those areas of learning and development aren't being supported as strongly as others. So I think that's really important that you think about coverage of those 7 areas of learning and development. And quite often it's things like maths, isn't it, where practitioners aren't perhaps as confident, and so they tend to sort of skim over those or go to the safe activities that they know, the resources that they've got that they know really well. And I think the other thing is really having those conversations amongst the team as well, so that you're very clear that everybody is consistent in what they're saying to Ofsted as well. And so everybody knows what we mean by intent, they know what we mean by implementation, and they know what they mean by impact. And I think that's really important. Sit down when you get the time, when you have those team meetings, and we know how precious that time is, but just sit down and focus on some of those things and just make sure there is that shared understanding.
Okay, thank you for that. I would just like to add my final comment that whenever people talk to me about the value of Birth to 5 Matters, how best to use it, I always reflect on the fact it's a reference book, not a story. Don't start at the beginning and read all the way through, as has been considered by Melanie and Tamsin here. Think about the issue that you're facing and then go to the relevant chapter in Birth to 5 Matters, all the supporting materials on the website. And you will find the answer there from a very constructive and staff development point of view and your improvements of the professional development. It just remains for me to thank Tamsin and Melanie for their expert contributions to today's session. We hope you found it useful. Bye-bye.